Hello, I'm Anna Krylova. I'm an associate professor of modern Russian history. I also teach historical theory and gender theory. Before I start, I would like to thank Oscar Sanchez-Sibony, for organizing this workshop series and for bringing us together. The title of my talk today is Imagining Socialism in the Soviet Century. Is a new master narrative possible? Today, I propose we critically interrogate the way contemporary scholars in and outside the field of modern Soviet history talk and write about Russia's encounter with the promise and project of socialist modernity. Much of the current academic and popular conversation about social justice, economic responsibility, and individual self-realization is informed by an explicit or implicit comparison between socialist and capitalist modernities. The Soviet variety of socialism understandably serves as a critical master referent in this conversation. My one contention today is that the way we currently talk and write about Soviet socialism imposes serious limitations, not only on available depictions of socialism in the Soviet Union, but also on the way we narrate and to draw on Hayden White, moralize histories of the 20th century. Central to my interrogation is a dominant historical narrative that ties the history of Soviet socialism to the Bolshevik origins. In this talk, I'm going to turn this fundamental plot assigned to the Soviet Union into a problem of historical analysis and also into a problem of theorizations of socialism. The stakes of my query, however, go beyond the case of the Soviet Union. The goal is to foreground the role that fixed fundamentals play in contemporary histories and theories of 20th century socialism. And by fixed fundamentals, I mean things such as Bolshevik origins, signature analytics of capitalism, or academic expectations of what a social society was or is supposed to be. So regarding the Soviet experience, I will argue that no one set of fundamental guiding ideas from 1900s, 1910s, 1920s can account for Soviet normative visions and social practices of socialism in the 20th century. So first, I would like to explain what I mean when I say the dominant historical narrative or a master narrative of Soviet socialism. Let me begin answering this question about what I mean by this this term by drawing your attention to the long-standing conversation in and outside of academia, which allows scholars to conflate in their work such basic political and cultural categories of modern Russian history as the Bolshevik, the Soviet, and the socialist. It is in part a matter of stylistic convenience, of course, to refer to the 74 years of the Soviet existence from its militant proletarian republic to Gorbachev's half-decade of perestroika as the Soviet period. However, when utilized in analysis of political and cultural change over the course of a Soviet century, this stylistic convenience rests on a body of scholarship that assigns undergirding cultural and ideological continuity to what was in fact a period of social and economic transformation, unprecedented in Russian history. In this historical scenario, which is dominant today in Western historiographies, key ideological and cultural parameters of the Soviet project as a whole are tied to the Bolshevik origins, and those Bolshevik origins actually enjoy a puzzling degree of independence from their socioeconomic circumstance. So the master narrative that explains this puzzling independence of Soviet ideology and culture from socioeconomic conditions goes as follows. The Bolshevik political cultural vision of socialism arrives onto the Russian revolutionary scene between 1900s and 1920s. It is put into practice in the 1930s and continues at the fundamental level to define economic and cultural parameters of the Soviet modernity project after the war, eventually ossifying, stagnating, and causing its collapse. The most troubling aspect of this master narrative is not only the assertion that the Soviet Union's post-war economy, culture, and ideology were fatally set into pre-war Bolshevik Stalinist patterns, but that they headed for collapse somehow in tandem. So in striking contrast with the prevalent academic understanding of capitalist modernity as the antithesis of stability, socialist modernity ends up being consumed and eroded by inertia of its original misguided ideals. In our master vision of Soviet socialist modernity, the decade of the 1930s plays a crucial role. So arguing that during this period, the Bolshevik core agenda was finally objectified into economic, social, and cultural and ideological principles of the Soviet state, scholars predicate the connotations of the Soviet and the socialist on the fulfillment of the Bolshevik fundamental ideals. And in the field of modern Russian history, those fundamentals, let me remind you, stand for the Bolsheviks' anti-capitalism, anti-individualism, and also they stand for the Bolsheviks' resolutely collectivist vision of modernity centered on the ideal of the working class and its collectivist ethos. Or we can summarize those ideals and tenets as the Bolshevik infatuation with the making of the proletariat-styled collectivist man. And the significance of the working class collective in the Marxist Bolshevik vision of socialism cannot be overstressed, right? The working class collective was, after all, supposed to be the side where alternative collectivist and socialist habits of thought and practice were to come into being. So my query today is actually into the non-controversial. That is the academic approach to the Bolshevik Stalinist script of alternative socialist modernity that has de facto become a comprehensive analytical framework for the study of the entire Soviet socialist project in the 20th century. In what follows, I want to reflect whether the Bolshevik anti-individualist tenets modeled after the proletariat ideal that undoubtedly informed imagination and everyday life of a new type of modern industrial society in the 20s and 30s and early 30s could indeed become the actual language of the industrial Soviet society once it came into being. How was, for example, the anti-individualist cultural paradigm of Bolshevism to address the profound social transformation brought about by the 1930s industrialization, namely the appearance of an urban and professionally differentiated middle class defined by the alienating and self-centered character of intellectual labor and the expectations of urban privacy. So contrary to the Bolshevik identified script of socialism, I argue that over the course of the 20th century, the Bolshevik aspirations and visions gradually lost their central position, and it could hardly have been otherwise. Let us start building an alternative narrative of Soviet socialism by quickly looking at available socio-demographic analysis of Soviet society before and after the war. So in striking contrast to the general tale of stagnation, the socio-demographic account assigns watershed events in the social history of the Soviet Union to the post-war period. It is, for example, only by the 1970s that the pre-war and post-war urbanization booms produced a predominantly urban society with 58% of the population living in new urban spaces. And it also were the post-war years that saw the making of the professional middle class into a mass class, growing at a rate surpassing that of the workers, increasing from 11 million in 1941 to 35 million in 1983. Instead of stagnating modernity stuck in the pre-war decade, one encounters a modernity, the history of which only begins in the 1930s. So the arrival of this urban and middle-class inflected socialist modernity naturally did not do away with individualizing routines of urban living and alienating self-centeredness of intellectual labor that the Bolsheviks wanted to overcome. On the contrary, as many scholars have demonstrated, individualizing habits were inherent to socialist modernity. Already in the middle of socialist industrialization in the 1930s, there began to appear differentiated groups and later an army of workers engaged in so-called intellectual labor, the technical, scientific, managerial, and artistic middle classes. Their career choices and very principle of professional preparation relied on the presupposition of individual aptitude and innate predispositions. The professional modus operandi at school, university, office, and lab relied on numerous individualizing routines of studying and problem solving, activities requiring solitude and time with oneself. So the point of this very brief sociodemographic detour is not to point out one more time the striking structural affinities between socialist and capitalist patterns of industrialization and modernization. It is to ask, what happens to the discursive cultural and ideological realm of the Soviet society when the modern, alienated, and self-focused individual becomes a mass social phenomenon? According to the master narrative at our disposal today, nothing reminiscent of a qualitative change happens. So contrary to the established story, I have argued that the crisis of Bolshevik worldview, in fact, began to unfold as early as the mid-1930s. The crisis began to unfold at what I call the situation level of history living in people's everyday lives. When Komsomol and party activists, for example, of the revolutionary generation, together with Soviet journalists, writers, educators, began to encounter the unexpected new phase of modernity in their everyday life. So in the 1930s, this new and unexpected phase of modernity was most vividly objectified in much celebrated school graduates who skipped the ranks of the proletariat and headed directly for university education and middle-class professional careers. It was to describe this generation preparing for white-collar careers that the notion of the new Soviet person was first created and used in the middle 1930s. And the term Soviet acquired connotations of socialist identity that exceeded those of the Bolshevik ideal. So in the 1930s press, for example, one can see various attempts of people making sense of this kind of new phase of Soviet modernity. I would like to feature two distinct kind of patterns. So one mode in which this phenomenon of of modernity that no one expected was addressed would be familiar to scholars of modern Russia. Using it, actual historical subjects address the new phase of Soviet industrial modernity by drawing on the Bolshevik narrative. They condemned the new generation for being bourgeois, and they prevented those young people from joining the Young Communist League and also the party. So in Pravda, such a critique was personified by a stunned Komsomol worker activist of the older generation, writing to the newspaper about the uncanny resemblance of the young post-revolutionary generation to bourgeois classes of the former regime. Such a Komsomol activist was certainly speaking Bolshevik when complaining about the educated professional youth. To him, instead of being new and socialist, young people appeared to be lacking proletarian class consciousness and collectivist spirit that seemed to exhibit alarming individualist habits, such as the need of privacy. So, but the 1930s press coverage of these disturbing features of emerging socialist industrial modernity was carried well beyond the limits of Bolshevik sensibilities and fears. A novel language, a set of categories had to be invented by Soviet journalists, educators, writers, social scientists, and by Soviet teachers and school children themselves to overcome the poverty of the Bolshevik collectivist vision of the proletariat style socialism. So the changes that were put in motion in the 1930s were deep and epistemic. So if champions of the Bolshevik collectivist agenda privilege the collective as the condition of possibility of individuality, and at times aimed at eliminating the very ontological difference between the individual and the social. In contrast, the emergent post-Bolshevik alternative posited a new task of learning how to connect individual predispositions and goals with the social good. So I treat this new development, which provided Soviet citizens with a formal language to present individual and social dimensions of their lives as distinct entities in need of relation, but not negation or identification, as the epistemic beginning of a new discourse, practice, and social policy on the socialist individual and its industrial society. So let me give you an example, which I considered in my article, Imagining Socialism in the Soviet Century. So this example comes from the 1930s Soviet pedagogy. The emergent theory of social personhood and pedagogical practices were very clearly set against the preceding Marxist Bolshevik pedagogical tradition. The one that Nadezhda Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, for example, had developed in practice before 1930s. So unlike the short-lived Bolshevik pedagogy, the Soviet pedagogy of the 1930s ended up defining the rest of the Soviet period. And the discursive gap between the 1920s pedagogical theory and the late 1930s theorizations was stunning. For example, 1930s pedagogical theorists criticized the 1920s tradition for overestimating something that defined the Bolshevik Marxist view of the new kind of view of Soviet kind of alternative socialist subjectivity. The value, what they were criticizing them for, they were criticizing the 1920s specialists for overestimating the value of productive labor and for imposing the reign of depersonalization on the Soviet school system. So a proposed new method of the 1930s called for individual approach to students and treated it as the main mechanism for uncovering students' innate abilities and developing their well-rounded personalities. So in accordance with this new vision, the mighty ideal of the new man, the collectivist, was no longer a stated goal. Most importantly and inevitably, the notion of the collective, of the social good, too underwent a serious modification. The emergent Soviet pedagogy did not need the Bolshevik Marxist elaborate theory of the proletarian collective, but it didn't banish the category of the collective as a constitutive experience in the making of the socialist, well-rounded individual. The notion was imaginatively re-theorized as a different, and the proletariat collective was turned into a concept of differentiated group. So a differentiated group is an actual term from the Soviet pedagogical theory, which I think we need to take very seriously. I'm going to show two images to demonstrate how this kind of new socialist worldview was translated into the language of photography, for example. So the first image comes from 1931. It comes from the illustrated journal Огонек. It depicts a Komsomol meeting at the Moscow brake plant. Filling up a small room, the Komsomol group projects tight internal unity and a shared purpose, while featuring no one in particular, except the collective itself. So the next image comes from 1935. It was featured in Pravda, and it depicts the concept of a differentiated collective of socialism. So this photograph also captures students of Moscow school number 12, who form a loose group as they face the camera. It is in fact their faces with their irreducible individuality that make the photograph. And their faces also stand for the students' different intellectual and professional aspirations, which are described in the caption underneath the photograph. The photograph's very composition, in other words, underscores a novel meaning of the collective on the scale of a social or the modern socialist society that depends on the recognition and realization of individual differences, a very useful companion of the modern industrial society and the construction in the Soviet Union. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I would like to draw some conclusions. So in a society where less than a decade ago, an individual was to become one with the proletarian collective in order to begin one's rise toward a new humanity, in a society where the dictum of the collectivist man was often understood as a virtuous sacrifice of one's personal striving, an invitation to simply connect one's a priori individual self to the social good of a socialist society was a conceptual breakthrough and relief for Soviet people. The notion of being socially useful, for example, no longer implied that the personal and the collective or the social were in need of some kind of merger. Nor the person was a derivative of the collective. Instead, the agenda to be socially useful implied that the personal and the social were distinct experiences, entities that needed to be related but not negated. So in everyday lives of Soviet people, the romance with the proletariat of the previous, or the romance with the proletariat of the previous decade was not strictly speaking erased. School children studied the history of the proletarian movement. They also studied the history of the Great October Revolution. They visited factories along with movie theaters and museums. So in the 1920s, proletarian ideal was in the process of becoming akin to a sightseeing trip, a museum piece, a homework assignment to be visited, consumed, prepared, but not to be lived. So the Soviet encounter with socialism, in other words, offers historians more than one normative script. And as a result, it also calls for a critical re-evaluation of what we mean when we say Bolshevik, socialist, Soviet, and what Soviet socialism stands for. To make sure that I'm not misunderstood, I want to kind of repeat my argument about the post-Bolshevik visions of socialism and socialist relations within this vision. This argument is not about the rise of the individual or individualism in place of the collective. It is rather about a shift in conceptualizations of the relationship between the socialist self and the socialist society, away from the Bolshevik insistence on the working class collective as the cradle of socialist alternative. By the 1980s, this post-Bolshevik Soviet mode of socialist thought and practice would become dominant, while the Bolshevik view could be largely found mainly in Soviet historical movies, where the Bolshevik worldview would be featured and unintentionally caricatured as revolutionary maximalism, a thing of the distant past. So the larger agenda that can be derived from this from this very, very sketchy look into the transformation that the Soviet society underwent in its self-perceptions, calls for a conceptual and epistemic shift in our approaches. The shift should entail our guiding categories of analysis, habits of thought, habits of theorization, and habits of narration. Moreover, the fixed fundamentals of the Soviet project cannot be successfully questioned without an engaged conversation with the current scholarship on Eastern Europe that has been borrowing and struggling with the Soviet analytics, nor can it be done without a parallel questioning of the assumed formulaic parameters of the Soviet Union's conceptual other, 20th century liberalism and market capitalism. What we definitely do not want to do, I believe, is to lift the Soviet story from its present-day ossifying and stagnating narrative and insert it into the readily available categories developed for the study of capitalism and liberalism. Such a move would erase once again the practical richness and theoretical sophistication of the 20th century socialist tradition. Thank you.